When Ellen DeGeneres mocked Karoline Leavitt's cross on national television, she expected applause, and she got it. But what came next wasn't laughter. It was conviction. What began as a smirking punchline quickly unraveled into a spiritual confrontation that no one, especially Ellen, saw coming. Because when you mock what someone holds sacred, you don't just spark controversy. Sometimes you invite God into the room. And when he shows up, everything changes. This is the story of one woman's faith and another woman's awakening. If you enjoy powerful storytelling like this, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. It started with a clip, 30 seconds long, torn from a congressional hearing and plastered across social media. In it, Representative Karoline Leavitt stood tall and unwavering, delivering a fiery defense of religious liberty. She didn't shout. She didn't shake. But there was something in her voice, something unashamed, as she touched the small gold cross at her neck and declared, "I answer to God before government." Within hours, the clip made its way into the monologue of one of America's most beloved entertainers, Ellen DeGeneres. It was supposed to be lighthearted. Another punchline, another cultural jab. Ellen leaned into the camera, cross-referenced Karoline's statement with a quick quip about fashion statements pretending to be faith, and rolled her eyes as the audience erupted in laughter. I mean, if that necklace gets any more airtime, it's going to need its own congressional seat, she joked. Applause. Cheers. Hashtag after hashtag. The machine of modern mockery roared to life. Late-night editors clipped the moment. TikTok comedians layered soundbites over Karoline's speech with ironic gospel choirs. Political commentators on the left praised Ellen's brave stand against religious extremism. Influencers mimicked Karoline's speech with plastic crosses from dollar stores, laughing their way to viral fame. And through it all, Karoline said nothing. She didn't release a statement. She didn't go on TV. She didn't tweet. She simply continued her work, the same quiet cross glinting from her collar, as if it had nothing to prove. But something was happening. Beneath the surface of the viral frenzy, a different conversation was taking place. People weren't just watching Ellen's joke. They were watching Karoline's silence. In kitchens and coffee shops across the country, Americans began asking each other questions they hadn't asked in years. What if faith isn't something to be mocked? What if wearing a cross isn't performative, but courageous? Among them, a father who hadn't prayed in decades, quietly placing his late mother's rosary back on his dresser. A teenager in public school, debating whether to wear her own cross necklace to class the next morning. A grandmother in Ohio who whispered, "She reminds me of the women who raised me." The media told one story, but the people were hearing another. And somewhere, in the quiet moments Ellen couldn't see, faith was beginning to speak louder than mockery ever could. Because when a symbol is mocked, the world laughs. But when a symbol is witnessed, with quiet strength and no apology, it begins to shine. And in Karoline's silence, America began to lean in. While the media machine spun its endless cycle of laughter and ridicule, she moved in silence. No interviews, no tweets, no camera-ready rebuttals, just the same daily routine, the same deliberate steps through marble halls. The same gold cross resting at the base of her throat. Inside her office, the world's noise felt distant. Headlines screamed her name. Social media flooded with edited memes and smug commentary. But she didn't flinch. She didn't need to. Her team didn't understand. "You should say something," one of them urged. "Push back. Own the moment." Another floated the idea of a primetime sit-down, a chance to reclaim the narrative. She shook her head, not out of fear, out of something stronger, conviction. It wasn't that she didn't feel the sting. Mockery hurts, especially when it's so public. But this wasn't new. The world had always ridiculed those who stood for something eternal. That cross wasn't jewelry. It was armor. And then came the letters. Hundreds of them, pouring in from all across the country. Some typed, many handwritten. A 12-year-old girl from Texas wrote, "I wore my necklace to school today because you weren't afraid." A retired teacher said, "I stopped praying years ago, but watching you stand there reminded me who I used to be." None of these people knew each other. Different states, different stories. But they were all drawn to the same thing. Not the politics, not the performance, but the quiet power of someone who didn't bow. In one letter, an elderly widow recalled the day her husband died. "I was alone in the room," she wrote. "Except I wasn't. God was there. I'd forgotten that feeling until you reminded me." Those words struck deeper than any headline. They weren't about policy. They weren't about ideology. They were about presence. The presence of something bigger than approval, bigger than applause. Meanwhile, the other woman, the one behind the joke, was enjoying the moment. The segment had done its job. The numbers were up. Her audience loved it. She leaned into the applause like a warm spotlight, unaware that somewhere out there, something invisible was beginning to shift. Because ridicule may win the room, but reverence reaches the soul. And behind the scenes, the woman in silence kept walking her path, unshaken, uninvited to defend herself, unwilling to play the game. She didn't need to. The cross around her neck was saying everything she couldn't. And more people were starting to listen, not to her voice, but to the God she refused to hide. No anger, no outrage, just the kind of stillness the world doesn't know what to do with. And that silence? It was starting to sound like thunder. It could have stopped there. The joke had landed. The clip had gone viral. Social media had already declared it iconic. But for Ellen, the reaction wasn't just success. It was fuel. The more people laughed, the more she leaned in. She opened the next show with a smirk and a segment called Cringe or Cross, flashing images of public figures wearing Christian symbols and daring her audience to vote, sincere or performative. The crowd loved it. Next came the props. Oversized crucifixes, glittery rosaries, even a cardboard cutout wearing a MAGA hat and a giant chain with a plastic cross. The joke was no longer subtle. It was a spectacle. She parroted the congressional clip again, but this time she didn't just roll her eyes. She mimicked the voice, the posture, the prayer. "I don't answer to Congress," she said, mock serious. "I answer to Target's jewelry aisle." The studio roared. The laughter echoed like thunder, but this time, not everyone was smiling. Backstage, one of her producers hesitated before cueing the next segment. "We might be pushing a little hard," he said. "It's starting to feel personal." She brushed it off. "It's comedy. They'll get over it." But they didn't. Later that night, a quiet ripple spread across social media. Not from conservative influencers, but from regular viewers. A nurse from Minnesota tweeted, "I've always loved the show, but something about this feels ugly." A liberal podcast host wrote, "We're allowed to disagree with faith. But mocking it? That's not the win we think it is." One clip, edited without the laughter, made its way to a former colleague. "I've known her for years," he said. "She used to make fun of hate, not belief." For the first time, the applause began to feel hollow. Still, Ellen pushed forward. On camera, she was confident, poised, witty, but off stage, something lingered. That moment from the charity gala, when the congresswoman had looked her in the eye and thanked her, of all things, for the reminder. It didn't make sense. She was supposed to be the clever one, the one who got the last word. But instead of outrage, she'd been met with calm. Instead of offense, she'd been met with grace. And, somehow, it was starting to unravel her. But there was no time to dwell. The machine was still rolling. There were bookings to confirm, segments to write, jokes to polish. As long as the lights stayed on, everything was fine. At least, that's what she told herself. But the truth was already creeping in. Because for all the laughter she could manufacture, there was no punchline strong enough to silence conviction. And the more she mocked what she didn't understand, the more people began to wonder what she was trying to hide. The charity gala wasn't meant to be dramatic. It was one of those carefully curated, camera-free events where politicians mingled with celebrities, where the wine was expensive and the smiles rehearsed. The organizers had assigned the seating without realizing what they were setting in motion. Ellen arrived late, dressed in sleek black, sunglasses on indoors, like always. She moved through the room with the confidence of someone used to being recognized, but that night, the recognition felt different. Softer, more cautious. Across the ballroom, the congresswoman had already taken her seat. Their eyes met once. Briefly, Ellen looked away. She considered switching tables, texted her publicist. Got no response. Too late. Dinner was served. Polite conversation flowed. And for the first 30 minutes, they avoided each other entirely. But the silence between them was loud. Ellen finally broke it with a half-hearted joke. Something about how no one had offered her communion wine yet. A few people chuckled. The Congresswoman didn't. Instead, she turned to her and said, gently, "I'm glad we met tonight." Ellen raised an eyebrow. "Really? Truly," she said. "You reminded me why I wear this." She gestured toward the cross. Nothing flashy, just a small gold pendant resting on her collarbone. The same one that had become a symbol far beyond her control. Ellen gave a tight smile. "Well, glad I could help, I guess." There was a pause. Then something happened that Ellen didn't expect. The Congresswoman leaned in slightly, not confrontational, not self-righteous, and shared story. Not about politics, not about power, but about pain. A moment from her past. A hospital room. A diagnosis that left her frozen. No cameras, no supporters, just fear, and then a peace that came from nowhere. A stillness she could only describe as divine. It wasn't a sermon, she said. It was just him. And when you've heard that silence once, you never forget it. Ellen didn't respond. She didn't know how to, because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't on a stage. There was no cue card, no laugh track, just someone speaking plainly about something Ellen had spent her life avoiding. She stared at her plate, felt the weight of the room shift. "I'm not here to argue," the Congresswoman said. "I just wanted you to know I'm not ashamed. And you don't have to be either." There was no bitterness in her voice, no sarcasm, just sincerity. That unsettled Ellen more than any confrontation could have. She looked up. For a moment, all the cleverness drained from her face. She didn't say thank you, didn't apologize, but she didn't laugh either. She just nodded, slowly, and somewhere deep inside, something cracked, because what had started as a punchline had just become a mirror, and Ellen didn't like what she saw in the reflection. She didn't talk much on the ride home. The gala was over. The smiles had faded. The makeup was smeared at the edges. And for the first time in months, maybe years, Ellen felt tired in a way that had nothing to do with work. The silence from that dinner table lingered like smoke. Not heavy, not toxic, just undeniable. At home, she poured a glass of wine and sat down in front of the television. Her usual routine. Rewind the day, watch the highlights, revisit the laughs. It was a ritual she rarely questioned. But tonight, the usual clips didn't land. She watched herself mock the cross again, 3 times, 4 times, 5. Each replay was more hollow than the last. The punchlines now sounded like echoes in an empty auditorium. And the laughter? Forced, strange, distant. She muted the screen. Across the room, a shelf held an old photo. Her first studio, her first big break. She remembered that girl, hopeful, scared, raw. She remembered the fire in her belly, the sense of purpose. Back when being real meant something more than being liked. That version of her believed in something, even if she couldn't name it. Now, all she had was applause. Applause she had earned every night with sharper jokes and louder punches. She picked up her phone, typed a message to a friend. "Have you ever felt like you're becoming a stranger to yourself?" Then deleted it. Instead, she opened her notes app and wrote down a single word. Why? Why the joke? Why the segment? Why the need to humiliate someone who clearly wasn't playing the same game? Because it had never really been about the cross, had it? It was about what it represented. Something unshakable. Something not built on public approval. Something she used to crave, but no longer understood. She stood in the kitchen, alone, long after midnight. Her partner had gone to bed. The house was quiet, and that's when she said it. Softly, almost involuntarily. "God, are you real?" It wasn't defiant. It wasn't dramatic. It was barely audible, but it was real. No thunder, no lightning, no voice from the sky, just the silence. And yet, somehow, it didn't feel empty. She stood there for a long time, staring out the window into the darkness. No camera. No stage, just a woman who had spent decades making people laugh, now wondering if she'd spent too long running from what she couldn't explain. The moment passed. The house remained still, but something inside had moved, not enough to change everything, but enough to shake the foundation. And for the first time, Ellen realized maybe the one being mocked wasn't the woman in the cross. Maybe it was the one who needed it most and didn't know how to ask for it. No one expected the tone to change. The studio was prepped like any other day. Lights, laughter, cue cards, crowd wranglers, all ready to churn out another perfectly timed hour of smiles and applause. The staff had prepped a segment about spring fashion trends, a celebrity cooking demo, and a few leftover jokes about the congressional clip that had now lived far past its viral expiration date. But something was different. She walked onto the stage like always, smiling, waving, taking her seat with practiced ease. But when the cameras rolled, she didn't open with a joke. There was no smirk, no sarcasm, just a moment of silence long enough for people to notice. "I want to start today a little differently," she said, voice lower than usual. Not with laughter, but with something I haven't done in a while. The audience shifted in their seats. "I want to talk about humility." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't scripted. It was just real. She didn't name names. She didn't rehash segments. She didn't issue an apology. Instead, she talked about the danger of becoming numb, of using humor to hide discomfort, of letting performance replace truth. She admitted that sometimes jokes aren't brave. Sometimes they're shields. And for once, the room wasn't filled with applause. It was filled with silence. Behind the glass, producers stared. Was this a new bit? A pivot? A trial balloon? But she wasn't testing the crowd. She was finally speaking to herself. "Lately I've been thinking about the things we mock," she said, "and how often the things we mock are the very things we once needed, but forgot how to ask for." Not a sermon, not a confession, just a quiet unraveling of a persona built over decades. Online, reactions came fast and fractured. Some viewers praised the honesty. Others rolled their eyes. A few said she was finally growing. Others called it calculated. But somewhere, far from a studio, a woman in a quiet office watched the clip on a cracked phone screen. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply reached for a pen. The note was handwritten, 3 lines. "The cross doesn't defend itself. It doesn't need to. God's grace reaches us even when we don't reach for it." The envelope was unmarked. No return address. No branding. Just a message sent to a woman who had once mocked the very thing that now unsettled her. When the letter arrived, Ellen didn't open it on camera. She didn't frame it for attention. She read it in her dressing room. Alone. The words didn't accuse. They didn't shame. They offered something she hadn't felt in years. An invitation. To what? She wasn't sure. But it didn't matter. Because for the first time in a long time, she felt something deeper than applause. She felt seen. And maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as far from grace as she thought. It was a small church. Nothing fancy. White siding. Wooden pews. A steeple that had seen too many winters. No cameras. No lighting rigs. Just families in worn coats, kids squirming beside their parents, and a pastor with more conviction than charisma. She wasn't on the guest list. She didn't send advance notice. She arrived alone, in a beige coat and dark sunglasses, slipping quietly through a side entrance and taking a seat in the back row. Barely noticed, completely out of place. The congresswoman stood at the front, addressing a packed congregation. No podium, just a microphone and a small Bible in her hands. Her voice was steady, unadorned. She wasn't there to preach. She was there to testify. She spoke of strength, not the kind that wins elections, but the kind that survives ridicule. She spoke of truth, not the trending kind, but the kind that holds when no one else is clapping. She spoke of God, not the idea, but the presence, and how his presence had carried her through the fire, through the laughter, through the silence. In the back, Ellen sat motionless. She didn't plan to cry. She didn't even plan to feel. But something about the words, the quiet certainty in them, began to break something open. Not with force, with invitation. She looked down at her hands. In her left palm rested something small and unfamiliar. A simple gold cross necklace. The same one she had mocked, now resting against skin that had once rejected everything it represented. She hadn't worn it out of performance. She didn't even know why she'd brought it. Only that something had changed. For a moment, Her fingers clenched around the pendant, as if holding it too tight might make it vanish. Then slowly, she released her grip, let it rest where it belonged. And just like that, she wasn't hiding. Not from the room, not from herself, not from him. At the front, the Congresswoman paused, eyes scanning the room, resting momentarily on the woman in the back, offering no recognition, no spectacle, just a subtle nod. Not of victory, but of welcome. And in that stillness, in that unspoken exchange, something happened. Not a conversion, not a headline, not a dramatic reversal, just a beginning, a breath, a whisper, a prayer. One woman had worn the cross through the fire. The other had mocked it until she needed it. And now, in a wooden church in the middle of nowhere, both were held by the same grace. Because faith doesn't need permission, and God doesn't wait for applause. He waits for the heart that finally says, "I'm listening." As the final hymn filled the sanctuary, Ellen closed her eyes. No cameras, no punchlines, just tears. And in that quiet corner, beneath flickering stained glass, the cross shined,